was the key word. Across the United States, wages stopped, which means I can announce the following statistic if you've never heard it. The real wage, that is what the average American worker gets today, adjusted for the prices he or she has to pay, here in 2011, is what it was in 1978. There's been no increase in the average real wage of the American working class. And that had never been true before, basically, in the history of the country. So the 1970s changed everything. It's a watershed. The society changed in a fundamental way that meant the American working class would no longer have a rising wage. And therefore it faced a great decision. Well, will we therefore just stop and not have a better situation? The American dream of living better each generation is over. We'll announce to our kids that the promises that were implicit in their upbringing, that they'd have a college education, are now no longer operative. We didn't have such a national conversation in the 1970s. We pretended nothing was going on. We didn't deal with this social transformation as if it were that. We dealt with a social transformation as if it were an individual problem. And we went about as individuals, something we pride ourselves about here in this country, by trying to find an individual solution. And most Americans found the following two solutions. One, if I'm not going to get more wages per hour, I know, more hours. So American men took a second or third job. American women were already taking jobs. Old people came out of retirement, and young kids did a job on the afternoon and the weekend. Here's another statistic about how this worked. Over the last 30 years, the United States has zoomed to the #1 position in the world. Americans do more hours of paid labor per year than any other people in any other country on the earth. That was not true 50 years ago. In Germany, France, and Italy, the average number of hours of labor done per year is 20% less than here. That's a day a week. So when some of you who have the resources travel to France and Italy and come back with wonderful stories about their culture and how they sit and have meals for 4 hours and drink lovely wine. And this has nothing to do with culture. This has to do with time. They have it. We don't. They celebrate slow food movements. We invented fast food. But we have no time. So Americans have become exhausted and show all the physical and mental signs of exhaustion from that kind of labor. When you put together the extra labor and the fact that the women are crucial to the story, then the emotional holding together of the American family also begins to unravel in the 1970s. We become a nation that has epidemics of child abuse, spouse abuse. You know the story. The dysfunctional family becomes a cultural icon on television, millions of hours. Not Ozzie and Harriet, but you know, all of those funny programs about how people can hardly stand each other. And an interesting thing, as we become exhausted physically and stressed emotionally, the other way the American individual responds to this social crisis individually is by going on a borrowing binge no working class in the history of the world had ever done before. The savings rate in the United States went to 0. And Americans began to borrow more and more. Well, it doesn't take a genius or an actuarial degree to know that if the wages are not going up and the debts are going up, it's going to be pretty soon that you can't sustain the debts. You can't pay the interest and the amortization on a flat wage basis. 2007 is the year when the transformation of the 1970s could no longer be postponed. You couldn't maintain a rising consumption on your debts and your exhausted work anymore. Americans physically can't do more work, and nobody will ever lend them money again the way they did in the last 30 years, because as we now know, they can't pay it back. We're done. We are in a crisis now that isn't a short one, isn't a quick blip down, isn't V-shaped or U-shaped, the way economists like to say, because in a sense, it's the fruit of this entire country's history, the way I've just summarized it for you. That's why it's not going away anytime soon. That's why you shouldn't be surprised if the recovery is something you read about in the newspaper but never see anywhere else in your life. Let's now look at the other side. Let's look at the other side, by which I mean the employer. How did the last 30 years since the 1970s, how did it play out for them? Well, if the story of the working class I just gave you leaves you with an impression, and perhaps one that makes you slightly sad, let's go to the other side because you'll feel better. They've done better than ever before. Spectacular 30 years. And again, very simple to understand in economics. Over the last 30 years, what economists call productivity, the average amount of stuff that a worker produces in an hour of his or her labor for the employer then to sell, kept going up. The very computers I spoke to you about, better trained workers, more machinery, and workers having to work harder and faster. All of those things made what we as workers delivered to our employer go up for 30 years, year by year. Meanwhile, what the employer gave us stayed flat for 30 years. What we did for the employer goes up, and what the employer does for us doesn't. Hello? The gap between what we produced for the employer and what he pays us is called profits. They went crazy over the last 30 years. We've never seen anything like it. And of course, our stock market went nuts too, which is what happens since stocks are your claim on a portion of those profits. How did the employers of America, Main Street and Wall Street, how'd they deal with this? Well, it's really interesting. And again, partly it's interesting, and partly I'm going to try to tap your sense of humor. The first thing the business community did was to notice that they were rolling in money. They weren't paying their workers anymore, didn't have to, but the workers kept producing more. This is called good news. And no sooner do you realize that things are going real well than you need to develop a theory, an explanation. And our business community didn't waste a minute, leapt right in. And here was their explanation. It is the case, they said, that the profits are going crazy in our companies because the top managers are entrepreneurial geniuses. And our culture became a culture that celebrates them. Lee Iacocca became a name people heard of. He was the head of Chrysler or Ford. Jack Welch, the lead executive at General Electric, and so on. They wrote books, or rather, they paid an out-of-work journalist to write a book as interesting as last week's oatmeal, but it was a bestseller. How I Transformed GE from a little company making toasters into a global megacorp. All of this, and I'm now going to use a technical term in economics, all of this is bullshit. The reality of this is simply that they were getting more and more out of their workers and not paying them anymore. No mystery to the profits. This is about a social change that begins and ends with telling the working class, no more wage increase. You've had your good century, it's over. So instead, we were given this story about the genius boss, but they had the last laugh because there's another reason to say it's entrepreneurial genius, because if the reason the company is making so much money is because the manager's a genius, then it makes sense to pay the manager accordingly. And the 1970s begins the zoom of American top corporate payoffs, salaries and bonuses that take off. From being roughly 40-to-1, the ratio of a corporate executive to an average worker, it's now 400-to-1. How nice. How useful. I do understand after the crisis hit a couple years ago and we all learned about how much money Goldman Sachs and the others are earning, we were as a nation outraged by the enormity of their payment packages. And I'm glad we're outraged. We're just 30 years late. This begins in the 1970s. What else did business do? Number two, they accelerated the movement of jobs out of the United States. Very important that you understand. When a corporation closes a factory in Oakland and moves it to China, it's risky, it's expensive, it's dangerous. The more money you have coming into your company, the easier it is to take that risk, to spend that money, and to go through all the upsets and adjustments of moving production. So it facilitated the very process that brought it about. It made more jobs leave. Third thing, you'll really like this one. The third thing American business did was to understand, far better than the American left wing has, that in order to sustain a society that has been used for 100 years to raise the standard of living of its working class, to make it go through an adjustment where that's not going to happen anymore, you better be in charge and control of politics, or else that could spin in a dangerous direction. So over the last 30 years, our politics have changed, but perhaps not in the way you had thought. The mass of the working class withdrew from politics. I like to cite the work of a not Marxist sociologist at Harvard named Robert Putnam. Wrote a book with a funny title called Bowling Alone. Actually was a bestseller. And what he documents is the withdrawal of American working people from social engagements of any kind. Community organizations, labor unions, just withdrawal. Life was too difficult. The stresses at home were too great. The need to work so many hours was so overwhelming that social participation and also political participation was what had to give way. The machines atrophied, the political machines, the participation. And you know, if you don't participate, you don't pay much attention anymore either. The working class withdrew. At the same time, the business community, awash in money, moved in. They had the money. They could therefore play in the new game of politics, which isn't about organizing block by block, but is about TV ads. And the business community moved massively. It's not that the American people changed their politics from left to right. It's that the constituency of the left withdrew from politics. And the right moved in to fill the vacuum. But that wouldn't have been possible without this sea change in the root cause of our economic situation in the 1970s. Finally, the business community, awash in all this money, discovered something else. We are now so wealthy, these top corporate executives said, that we do not live in the same universe as other people. And one of the things we need specialists to manage the enormous sums of money that we're paying ourselves. We need a new kind of institution catering just to us. You all know what those are. Those are called hedge funds. And there began a tremendous new competition in the financial world in which stock brokers participated and banks participated and little independent hedge funds were set up everywhere, struggling to compete for the enormous sums in the hands of a relatively small number of individuals and companies that were sitting on mountains of wealth. And to compete, you had